We'll make the change over to Associate Professor Brett Neilson, who is well known to most of us here as the Director of the Centre for Cultural Research. He'll be presenting today on to the topic inside the tent, outside the tent, subjects of climate change in Copenhagen.
Okay, this is very much work in progress. It's the paper's a lot less theorised than what Fiona has presented, but I think it, within the frame of the project that there is kind of intermeshing that goes on. I'm going to tell a much more kind of banal story about the convention about to take place in Copenhagen, but I will try and grab for a few theoretical concepts as I proceed. So as we all know, the United Nations Climate Change Convention is going to take place in the city of Copenhagen from the 7th to the 18th of December of this year. The working name of this conference is, as you see, United Nations Climate Change Conference, but more officially within the terms of the convention, it's known as the Conference of the Parties, the 15th Conference of the Parties, who are the nation states that signed on to the convention, or COP15 is the acronym that you will see. Now, the aim of the convention is to broker a global climate change agreement for the period from 2012, when the first commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol expires. And Ivo de Boer, who's the executive secretary of this particular United Nations Convention, simplifies what's at stake here into 4 points. First is, how much are industrialized countries willing to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases? 2, how much are major developing countries such as China and India willing to limit the growth of their emissions? 3, how is the help needed by developing countries to engage in reducing their emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change going to be financed? And 4, how is that money going to be managed? Now, as we're all aware, there's massive media speculation about the likelihood or the possibility that this convention will fail to broker a global agreement on climate change. My question is, to begin this intervention, what's at stake in such a failure? Well, why don't we ask the person who'll be the chairperson of this particular convention, Connie Hedegaard, who is the Danish Minister for Climate and Energy. She's also the president of the UN Climate Change Convention. And I've grabbed this quote from her down here. She says, "If the whole world comes to Copenhagen and leaves without making the needed political agreement, then I think it's a failure not just about climate. Then it's the whole global democratic system not being able to deliver the results in one of the defining challenges of our century. And that is, and should not be, a possibility. It's not an option." So what is the chairperson of the convention saying here? She's saying what's at stake is the global democratic system, a particular series of institutions which mesh into each other and lead up to such events as this United Nations Convention. She says it is a possibility. It's a possibility that this system will not deliver the results in this particular case, but she said this should not be a possibility. This is not an option. It's unthinkable that the global democratic system could not be adequate to the purposes of brokering an agreement on the complex matter of climate change and the reduction of emissions. So this is how the officials of the convention itself see the issue. Now, Copenhagen is also host to another series of institutions. It's a city that has a rich tradition of social movements. There's been quite tense social antagonism in the streets of Copenhagen, particularly over the last decade. This came to a head in the end of 2006, the end of 2007, most recently when this building, the Ungdomshuset, Karen can probably give me a better pronunciation. The youth house, which is a squatted space used for various cultural events and social movement activities, linked into a network of social centres throughout Europe, in places like Italy and Germany, was closed down by the government and handed over to a fundamentalist Christian association. This sparked a series of conflicts in the street, one of the calmer ones which you see here, which culminated on the 16th of December 2006 in a legal protest, classic sort of riot street scenes, clashes between protesters and riot police, both in helmets, firebombs being thrown, that kind of scenario. As we know, there are efforts underway to mobilise protests on the streets of Copenhagen during the convention. So let's see what the protesters have to say about what's at stake in their activities and their social practices in the context of this particular event. Okay, this is taken from a site that is inactive today, so I can't get it through the live web that I have installed. But the site is called Never Trust a Cop. The organisation is called Never Trust a Cop, and this is one of many sites associated with the kind of counter-convention activities which will take place in Copenhagen. But I quote from their second call to action. They say the catastrophe is real and climate change is one of its many symptoms. The COP15's inevitable talk of saving the world from the climate crisis is an elaborate hoax to disguise COP15's true purpose: to restore the legitimacy of global capitalism by inaugurating an era of green capitalism. A new rhetoric of saving the climate will exist to justify their repression, their fortified borders, their colonial resource wars, to give the emperor new clothes. Our response to this astounding lie is an uncompromising and absolute no to their system. So again here, what is at stake is being identified as a system. What Conor Hedegaard talks about as the global democratic system, what here is identified, I guess, as the system of global capitalism, with the COP15 as a kind of significant actor in that system, is what is being refused in this particular articulation of a kind of Schmittian version of friend-enemy politics that is really pitting us against them. But my question is, how do we look at this political division between those acting inside the tent and those acting outside the tent in Copenhagen? I want to suggest in this paper that the relationship between them is more complex, that there are indeed political divisions and different forms of organisation in each camp, and indeed points of intersection, overlap, and more microscopic forms of contention, which is where I will eventually lead. But let us think first about how the convention itself is organised. This is from the site. This is the site of the the convention itself, and it gives you an idea of how the participant groups break down. So the convention is the 15th annual meeting of the parties to this UN Framework Convention, which came into being following the so-called Earth Summit in Rio of 1992. The first of these conferences of the parties was in Berlin in 1995. Kyoto was the one that took place in 1997. Now, the convention itself is an interesting instrument of global governance. It arranges various institutions and actors in a hierarchical order, and in so doing, it partakes of a form of hybrid compensation that consists of differing and indeed often conflicting elements. So the parties themselves are the 154 nation states that signed the convention, and in signing the convention, as Hans Kelsen pointed out in his classic juridical text, The Law of the United Nations, a state does more than recognise the rules established by the convention. It participates in their creation. So the states are a kind of constituency that not only agrees to follow a convention, but indeed brings that document, that agreement into being. Now, the parties are divided into 4 groups or annexes, given different responsibilities under the convention. As you will see, there's, as in that initial quote from Ivo de Boer, there's quite a strong division between the notion of an industrialised country and a developing country, all those kinds of distinctions that post-colonial theory has worked to dismantle to some extent. But there are subdivisions which I won't run through now because I'm aware that you will have been looking at them on the screen. There are observer organisations that can be that are admitted to the convention, including intergovernmental organisations, IGOs, and non-governmental organisations. Interestingly, all of these are conceived of as representative organisations. So we see a chain of representation here. The governments of the nations represent the people. They in turn represent the delegates to the convention. In turn, represent the government, and so forth. Okay, where are we going here? It's taking too long to flick through these, but indeed on the slide I wanted to show you, it's describing even the non-governmental organisations as representative organisations that enter into this convention. The groups opposed to the convention are organised as a more diffuse network of networks. Nonetheless, there remain some vertical and exclusionary principles that are brought into play. So climate justice action is the main organising network of the protests that will take place in Copenhagen. This is quite an immense site. It's building every day at the moment, but it does say that it is, if you look at the second paragraph there, the network is open to individuals and groups that agree with the network goals, and it lists the goals, principles for working together, and the call to action. So it does introduce some, despite its kind of the horizontal ethos of this particular network, it does have some instruments of governance. Nonetheless, there are groups that will partake under this umbrella, such as the Never Trust a Cop group, from whom I quoted before, who disavow these mechanisms of governance. So to quote from that same site that I couldn't get onto today, the Never Trust a Cop group says it's time to state we are going to consciously attack the structures supporting the COP15. We will break through the lines of their police. We will refuse to negotiate with warmongering governments and embedded media. We will refuse to side with sellout NGOs and the would-be managers of the protest. We will refuse all governments and governance and not just delegitimatise the present ones. So apart from reinstating that friend-enemy model of the political, which I discussed earlier, this is a declaration of ungovernability, and indeed it signals a potential for conflicts and disagreements that are unfolding outside of the tent amongst those who will protest. So what do the disagreements inside the tent look like? It's not only outside the tent that we know that there can be disagreements. For instance, in the COP14 conference that took place in Poznan, Poland last year, there was a protest that took place inside the convention on the part of various groups, including the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and other NGOs who were outraged in response to an action of the so-called Kansas nations, that is Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United States, who successfully opposed the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in a decision on a document called the Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. You can click through here to see briefly what a kind of contestation inside the convention looked like. Needless to say, the possibility that a political agreement will not be reached by the parties acting inside the tent at the convention also points to the possibility of conflict. And indeed, there are controversial elements of the draft negotiating text that are already being discussed by the various parties, and indeed there are differing positions emerging. There are quite a few of these. I don't know how many of you have spent your bedtime hours kind of reading this draft negotiating text, but I'll give you one example here. What's at stake here is the way that the Conference of the Parties is looking to control financial transfers between so-called industrial countries and so-called developed countries, which are seen as necessary in order to introduce the capacities to reduce emissions in the poorer countries. And what's at stake here is that the COP15 refers to itself as government, okay? There will be three basic pillars: government, facilitative mechanism, and financial mechanism. And this phrase government here is causing disturbance in some parties. For instance, the British climate change denier Lord Monckton is up in arms about this in the press because he says this element of governance would disturb the sovereignty of nation states who are parties to the convention. That implies a system of taxation and redistribution over which those parties would have no control. So equally, while the protesters, or some elements of the protesters are declaring themselves ungovernable, some elements of the parties are also declaring themselves ungovernable, because one figure of ungovernability is precisely sovereignty, right? If you are a sovereign body, then you are not going to be governed by any body or institution or convention which imagines itself as an umbrella or in some way to operate above you in a hierarchy. So you can see that there in what's being discussed in Copenhagen, there are potential changes in the system of global governance, at least with respect to Copenhagen. And I think here we see how governance and sovereignty move together as concepts. There's not like a historical transition from one to another, but it's an analytical distinction in which both are at play and both are being reshaped. And I think here of what Saskia Sassen says about sovereignty in her book, Territory, Authority and Rights, where she talks about sovereign power being detached from the centripetal power of the nation state and beginning to operate in a centrifugal multiplication of assemblages. Sovereignty, she writes, remains a systemic property, but its institutional insertion and its capacity to legitimate and absorb all legitimating power to be the source of the law has become unstable. Okay, another way we can begin to classify the differences within the protesting bloc, it can be interpreted through the ideas of different blocks that exist in these protests, green blocks, purple blocks, black blocks, bike blocks, and so forth. And an easy schematization of the big debate that exists within the protest groups it could be described as an ideological difference between ecological and anti-capitalist activists. So the former ascribe to a politics of limits and conservations. They sideline the human for a focus on the earth and the forms of life that interact with it, while the latter contend that the climate crisis is a symptom of capitalism and tend to focus on the open and limitless potentialities of human production. So there are big kind of political debates going on here between those two different positions. Are they reconcilable? If you key into these debates, you can see an awareness that in order to influence this process, there has to be some kind of ways of acting together. But these are quite different intellectual and political traditions. And much is at stake in whether these divergent courses can be negotiated and not imagined as in the map you can't see as two separate blocks who will go off and do different things within the protests as they were unfold. So there are new potentials for conflicts and confluences on either side in Copenhagen. But there are also, what I will turn to now, crossovers between those who are acting inside the tent and those who are acting outside. And there are probably many instances of these. I've just followed one particular instance of which I've become aware of. And interestingly, that has led this paper into the realm of the museum sector. But I imagine there could be others. This website is called Wonderful Copenhagen. It's a tourist website which is advertising the official cultural program of COP15. There are a slew of events which are listed down here. It's one of those pages that you keep scrolling down. The event from Australia is some of you may have heard about this movie about the Barrier Reef, which is going to be shown. But this cultural program has multiple points at which I think there are intersections between those acting inside and outside the tent. So we can move to the next slide. We're clicking down here to one particular part of the program, which is an exhibition arranged between a number of different art galleries and contemporary art centres and museums called Rethink, Contemporary Art and Climate Change. Now this to me looks like a very interesting and well-conceived exhibition. If you move up here, you could have seen this up here, but you see little kind of themes here which have themes like rethink politics, precisely what I'm trying to do in this paper, rethink borders, rethink nature. I mean, the kinds of questions that Fiona was asking, that we're asking in this project, that people in museums that we're working with are asking, are being thrown round in this exhibition. Okay, we can move to a particular part of this exhibition, which is called Rethink Kakatopia. It's a concept some of you may know from Jeremy Bentham. But this is a particular part of the cultural program which is being held in the Nikolai Contemporary Art Centre in the centre of Copenhagen. It's an old church that has been decommissioned and is now an art museum. What I'm interested in, if we can flick through to the next slide, is one particular group of artists that were commissioned by the Nikolai Art Centre in order to produce a piece of work for their exhibition called Rethink Kakatopia. These artists call themselves the Laboratory of the Insurrectionary Imagination. They're a Bristol-based group of artists and they work on the borders between art and politics. The particular piece of work that they have been producing for Copenhagen is called Put the Fun Between Your Legs. It involves a kind of a reassemblage of bicycles. They take bicycles, they rebuild bicycles in interesting ways, recombining bicycles with other kinds of mechanisms. And they plan to do this with many different bicycles and then contribute to the big demonstration that will take place on the 12th of December as a so-called bike block. Okay? Now, what I'm interested in is their relation with the museum. Yes, next please. Okay, I'm going to have to read off screen here because I was hoping you would read here. But basically what happened in the first week of this month, the museum, despite commissioning the work of these artists, said to them, we will no longer have you in this show. You will no longer be part of the official cultural program in Copenhagen. The artists got very upset about this and began to splatter emails all over the internet about aesthetic censorship, these kinds of practices. But what I want to do is read the rejection letter of the museum's director.
Do you want me to read it?
We're very close.
Oh,
we're very close.
go on.
Okay, we'll mess with this one.
It should be changing up there. Is it something new?
I think this is a setup. This is a presentation of something
Yes.
that's being performed.
Exactly. Well, look, I won't read the letter. Okay, here we go. Dear John. Dear John, I will find you later, but I want to send you an email first to be sure to explain to you my opinion more exactly than I might be able to do on the phone. As I was working on the draft of the contract last night, it got increasingly clear to me how absurd and impossible the situation would be for both of us. A contract that could really assure Nikolai the museum would make it very difficult to work with you. You would have to find ways to evade the contract, and I would feel very uncomfortable about that. You might easily be put in a difficult situation between Nikolai and a collective group you're working with. That means it could be difficult for you to control the communication, and so on. So, I mean, you can see how this director is kind of acting reluctantly. She knows that she's part of the official cultural program. It's clear there's a situation of conflict which will brew in the streets, that she's commissioned this work, that these artists will take place on the other side of that conflict, there's a difficult point of intersection here. You can hear the reluctance in this letter, you know. And if you read the reply letter, which is all about, we looked at the sunset and we realised that you're engaging in a process of aesthetic censorship. She offers to help the artists find somewhere else. And indeed the artists did find somewhere else. If we click through to the next slide, you'll see the outfit they managed to connect up with. Okay.
Wish to do that?
Just
I press no first, and then it comes back, press yes.
Okay.
okay.
No, it's okay.
They managed to link up with a group whose practice is to repossess abandoned gas stations, to turn them into places where people can borrow bicycles and look at art. It's a transnational institution. You can see it has, there are similar kinds of things in other cities. They have a shop. They're selling commodities on the internet, T-shirts and posters, and so forth. It's kind of an institution in formation. And I think this is getting towards some of the concepts that Fiona is talking about. It's getting towards a point where we can think about the differences, as Foucault says in the 78 essay, What is Critique? He draws a distinction between not being governed at all, which is what we're getting from the extreme side of the protesters and the nation states, to not being governed in this way. And it allows us also to see museums themselves as spaces of conflict. It's as spaces in which these issues are being worked out in contingent ways. And interestingly, some of the other museums in this Rethink exhibition have been part of, earlier in their lives in this decade, have been part of the so-called institutional critique movement in contemporary art, which is another thing that we've been looking at in terms of the discourses of new institutional forms we've been looking at in this project. It's a series of practices that has evolved mostly in the art world, and Ben has produced a report on this for the project, but we're thinking about how they might apply to science museums. I myself have been involved in writing around some of these issues of new institutional forms, particularly in the work that I do with my co-author Ned Rossiter. But I thought I would end with a quote from another author who's working around these issues, who actually visited the CCR earlier this year, and that's Gerald Raunig from the European Institute for Progressive Cultural Policies. Scott, who's another project member, gave a response to the paper that Gerald gave. And Gerald talks about what he calls instituent practices. Let me read you a quote where he explains what he means by an instituent practice, which I think is what we can see unfolding in the context of these kinds of agreements and disagreements and intersections. It says, understood as a permanent process of constitution, instituent practices thwart the logics of institutionalization. They invent new forms of instituting and constantly link these instituting events. Against this background, the concept of instituent practices marks the site of a productive tension between a new articulation of critique and the attempt to arrive at a notion of instituting after traditional understandings of institutions have begun to break down and mutate. When we speak of an instituent practice, this actualization of the future in the present is not the opposite of an institution in the way that utopia, for instance, is the opposite of a bad reality. Rather, instituent practice as a process of concatenation of instituent events means an absolute concept exceeding mere opposition to institutions. It does not oppose the institution, but it does flee from institutionalization and structuralization. And just as a visual coda to this, I wanted to show you what happened to the Nikolai Museum a few days after they rejected the participation of the Laboratory of the Insurrectionary Imagination when Barack Obama was visiting Copenhagen to make the case for Chicago being an Olympic city, and Greenpeace protesters climbed the spire of the Nikolai Museum and hung this banner saying, "Obama, right city, wrong date." Thank you.
Thank you, Brett, for persisting through our first technological
It's okay, you
hurdle.
couldn't limit me in time for your
I didn't.
embarrassment.
I was going to ask you to finish up, but then I thought I should not.
Yeah.
So what I thought we'd do now is just open up for questions on both the presenters. So if anyone's got any questions for or Brett or to both, please. Okay, well I'll start then because I do have one here that I'm glad I've got the opportunity to ask it. Brett, some of those positions that you're presenting precede the climate change debate in terms of this sort of notion of the anti-globalisation movement and the sort of the notion of this ungovernability and the tensions over nation-state sovereignty as well on the other side of things. And you can think about things a bit like the EU referendum, the fall down of that process based on some of those things, but you can also think about, coming out of Seattle, the notion of the anarchy side of things that won't fit into the structures of protest as well. So when you start talking about notions, and I suppose it links up to sort of liquid governmentality ideas here, how liquid are these positions? We're talking about, and it comes back to sort of the emails that you presented there as well, where even though there are tensions that are going on, they're very difficult to break down. And so, I mean...
Yeah, look, one can recognise patterns and, these kinds of changes are haphazard and, equally there are entrenchments and so forth. But, I think you're asking this question more in terms of the social movements than the United Nations structure, so I'll answer it in that terms. But even there you can see a kind of evolution. You can see an evolution in the modes of organising and governance in these movements. In Europe it's often explained as, Heiligendamm in 2007, where the G8 happened. That's often kind of, within the social movements, they talk about a movement from a southern European Italian model, which was Geneva, to Heiligendamm, where you had the clown armies and the pink blocks and, all of these kind of, tactics, which are some way familiar, like flowers and guns and so forth. But what's really at stake here is those kinds of activities coming much more into contact now with groups like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. These people have not really been involved in that series of Seattle and post-Seattle counter-summit protests and so forth, and they have quite different positions. And these are being renegotiated, as we speak. For instance, one thing that's going on is, precarious labour has been a big issue in the European social movements organised around questions of capitalism, capital and labour. And now one way in these conversations is unfolding is that figure is moving across to, the sort of precarity of forms of life on Earth. So there are, there are positions that change here. I think similarly, in terms of the convention, there are evolutions, there are debates, there are contentions, particularly around this issue of the UN as some kind of governing body. The fact that the chairwoman can say it is a possibility that this whole articulation of institutions is not adequate. I can't think of it, I can't bear the thought, but I admit that as a possibility. that there would have to be some other institutional formation in order to face this challenge. I mean, I think that admission from the chairperson of the convention is quite telling.
Well, I found your presentation fascinating, very, very thought-provoking. But one thing that I was wanting to explore a little more is this idea of the potential change of governance. Is it the case that there are change of governance, or that there are new makeups of the same forms of governance taking the new challenges as the way of reproducing forms of governance that have been happening before? And I was thinking, you mentioned that the COP15 is like a form in which they are going to be controlling financial flows to countries and all that kind of thing. And in some ways that's similar to all the conditionalities that were happening with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and so. So it's like how much crises are used just to reshape the same forms of governance and reproduction of power in the same hands, kind of thing.
Well, I think that happens. I think that's a possibility. I mean, it's precisely what the protesters are saying about the whole, what Conor Hedegaard calls the global democratic system. I mean, they use the language of hoax and truth, and they're saying one thing, but what they're really trying to do is another thing, and reconsolidate various established powers, missions of colonial extraction, border reinforcements, so on and so forth. But, you know, I think both of these things can go on at the same time. You know, you may have power structures renegotiated and reproduced, but there may be interstices, you know, where things are being reinvented and renegotiated in that very process of reproduction, which is not to say it's, you know, a mechanical reproduction, as say, you know, Benjamin conceived it in that famous essay. And that, you know, there can be, I mean, repetition with a difference, of course, is an equally modernist trope. But you know, I do think that you can locate multiple points of renegotiation within what could easily be read negatively as a mere process of reproduction. I don't want that to be utopian, you know, and that was why I stressed that in that last quote, you know, and I would refuse that. But I think it would be a mistake to overlook these kinds of contestations and agreements. And look, I think the most probable result of this convention is that the protesters will declare it a failure and the parties will declare it a success, and they'll say, well, we haven't fully reached an agreement, but we've moved a long way and we've made a new deadline, or we've arrived at some kind of climate federalism where we agree that each state will set its own targets, or, you know, something like this. I mean...
Tony, yes.
Well, I just wanted, I really enjoyed both papers, but my questions to Fiona, which I thought was a wonderful rereading of Foucault in the light of the assemblage theory and so on, so it's great to be here. But a couple of questions. One is, and it seemed to me you were able to, you know, draw nearly all the Deleuze's categories and read them into or into a productive relationship with Foucault's work. But have you found any points of no-go between the two, as it were, where you're not able to produce a kind of like a rereading of Foucault? You need to go completely beyond him in the light of Deleuzean categories. And the second question is the project dealing a lot with kind of like international museum networks?
Well, one of our partners is Liberty Science Centre.
Right.
Yeah. But, yeah, that's we're not moving outside that particular
But I'm asking because one of
site.
the other big differences between, you pointed about the point about the 19th century museum and discipline, etc., but also the 19th century museum's framework was primarily national. And since the late 19th century, museums have become inscribed in all kinds of international flows and networks. And so I was just wondering whether that's an aspect of the project that you're engaged with.
Yes. Well, the whole transnational thing is huge. There are examples where enormous networks and museums operating in much broader transnational flows. And of course, climate change is an issue that is transnational. So that's actually driving some of this transnational, these kind of flows.
Yes.
I'm still working through a lot of Deleuze and Guattari's work as well. So I haven't sort of quite got there yet, but I'm sure that there will be some points of difference that, and working Foucault back into it too, some of those elements as well. I think you can read 19th century museums as assemblages as well, so it's because of those, yeah.
Well, no,
I mean, you're doing some of that too anyway yourself, yeah.
Well, there's the kind of those would refer to as something like concrete assemblages, but then
Yeah.
concrete assemblages get assembled into non-concrete assemblages.
Yeah.
They're much more kind of like fluid networks and relationships.
And
that
it-
we were talking about.
And talks about different sort of spatial patterns too, so you can read museums into those different sorts of analyses.
Okay, we're at time given our technical problems, so I just thought we might move on. There's other opportunities for discussion. I'm calling the break to be after Bob's presentation, and then we'll go on with Mary Ellis. Just so if you can hold on for that, that would be great. So now we're going to move on. Thank you to our first two presenters.